Okay. Well, firstly, I think it's just fantastic to be here and to see all the faces in the front row, the speakers and also the participants, many of whom were very much part of the original, if you like, event and subsequent elaborations of the event. And I think, it's really, as Marlene said, a really poignant moment to be back at the place where this kind of movement, a very important movement within British art history, started. So today, as you can see from the programme, I hope you've all got a programme. We've got a very full programme set into two different parts. This morning, I'll talk a bit about, in a minute, is raiding the archive, and in the afternoon we'll look at artworks, and then we'll have a panel of reasonings with respondents. But firstly, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, who I'm sure you're all aware and have all read his works, Kobena Mercer. He's a professor of history of art and African American studies at Yale in the States. And his work ranges across cross-cultural aesthetics, transnationalism, and looking at issues of race, sexuality, and identity and how they converge within art practice. His first book, Welcome to the Jungles, is a book I remember as an undergraduate being extremely influential in a lot of my thinking. In 1994, introduced new lines of inquiry, really, into art, photography, and film. And his works have featured in several anthologies, including Art and Its Histories, Visual Culture Reader, and Theorizing Diaspora. Kobena has written about many, many artists, including Keith Piper, Isaac Julian, Rotimi Fani Kayode, and he's edited and published very important anthologies, including that seminal one by MIT and Innova, Annotating Arts Histories. He is the inaugural recipient of the 2006 Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing, and he's currently working on another collection, a new collection, called Travel and See, Writings on Black Diaspora Art, and will contribute to a chapter to The Image in the Black in Western Art, which is that huge kind of Harvard University project that's really kind of a massive compendium of these works. So without further ado, I'll ask Kobena to come up and to give his presentation, then we'll have a short question and answer session after that. So Kobena, please welcome.
Okay, well, good morning. Thanks very much to Paul for that introduction. Today certainly has the feel of being an occasion, so I feel really honoured and excited to be here. And I'd also like to begin by just expressing my thanks both to the individuals and organisations that have contributed this, but especially to Marlene Smith, I think, in taking the initiative in setting up the Blk Art Group research project and in making it happen as well. So experience tells me that the best way to get started is to get started. So that's what I shall do. Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. Right. Okay, so I suppose it's a change of tone really, because now I'm going to be reading out. So it's right. So the Blk Art Group story has, I think, so far eluded narrative capture, and the question is, why is that? The breakthrough that was achieved by its individual members, Eddie Chambers, Claudette Johnson, Marlene Smith, Donald Rodney and Keith Piper, and all of their initiatives in convening the first National Black Art Convention and also exhibitions of the same year, that's 1982, such as the Pan-African Connection, is widely acknowledged. Shades of Black, for example, that came out in 2004, is introduced with a historical survey by Stuart Hall, which begins with a first generation who made their entrance in the 40s through to the 1960s, and comes up to date with a third generation emerging in the 90s, but it concentrates on the 1980s and the role of the Blk Art Group in particular as the decisive moment of transition in which the entire vocabulary for addressing cultural identity in late 20th century art went through a massive transformation, which also had the effect of altering the way in which we understood what happened in the first 80 years. But more broadly, however, the 1980s period, especially the early 1980s, tends, I think, to get encapsulated by what could be called the angry young blacks interpretation. And what's frustrating about the AYB approach, and this is, we've had the YBA, and this is with apologies for those with dyslexia, but now we've got the AYBs, the angry young blacks. What's frustrating is that the actual art produced by Blk Art Group members and others in this moment tends, I think, to take second place to the social and political context, such that these material specifics of practice, painting, drawing, mixed media installation, get overlooked. And in a sense, what happens is that it gets over-contextualized. It's almost too much context. There was indeed so much going on that this approach is understandable. There was so much going on in the crisis conditions of the early 1980s that it's understandable why context is given priority. In fact, if we were to take 1982 as a turning point in the story of Black Britain as a process of becoming, we have a clear-cut frontier between the 5 years after that point, from 1987 onwards, in which Britishness increasingly, albeit reluctantly, comes to accept its multicultural character. And then the 5 years prior to that, i.e. from 77 to 82, in which it's virtually impossible to conjoin black and British in the same sentence. And that's because they're separated by a frontier, a political and ideological frontier that's made extremely brittle by the resurgence of fascism as a response to the decline of industrial capital. And that's my focus here today. It's that period between 77 and 82. Because I think for 5 art students who were in their late teens and early 20s, as we've just heard, making their entrance through the institutions of higher education in the UK art schools, and we've got to bear in mind that these have always had a very important and distinctive role to play in post-war British cultural history. Getting their hands on canvas, on paper and plaster didn't lead to a uniform style or the idea of loyalty to one single medium, but rather to a cut and mix aesthetic that began to open up little holes, perforations, among tendencies that were otherwise closed to one another in a period where art and politics were characterized by sharply drawn frontiers. And that's because in 1977 you had to take sides, because right-wing politics was a living reality. And commenting on photographs such as these by Sid Shelton, these are photographs of Rock Against Racism activities, Mark Seeley has recently observed that, quote, "These images enable us to feel the ferocity of cultural difference being hammered out on Britain's streets," end quote. This is a visual index in Sid Shelton's photographs of 77 to 82, in which we can see, quote, "the steely determination of those who could no longer tolerate the archaic dullness of British society and its inherent inequalities that were ingrained across all levels of society." And I think the collective agency that was involved in coming together to form the Blk Art Group is one very clear example of the steely determination that this crisis moment gave rise to. But was anger the only emotional register among the so-called AYBs? I think the 2011 retrospective at the Sheffield Art Gallery, like the archival reconstruction of the thin black line at Tate Britain, which revisited the 1985 exhibition curated by Kobena Mercer and others at the ICA, were contemporary opportunities to take a deeper look at the actual work. And several issues strike me as being important in counteracting the problems of over-contextualization or contextual reductionism. And the main problem there is that the work itself tends to get cut off from what was taking place in the international art world as a whole. So my first observation is that what the AYB interpretation is actually responding to, for the most part, is paint that drips and splatters, smudged stencils, broken lettering, strident colour combinations, and other expressive forms of mark making in figurative practices that are emphatically manual and handcrafted. Move on. such as How Much Longer by Eddie Chambers of 1984, in their ability to call forth a gut-level response. Yet the voice through which Blk Art Group exhibition brochures and other mission statements speak, there is a forthright critique of racism that involves anger, but also there's optimism invested in future possibilities that can cut an opening into the closed structures of archaic institutional inertia. So for me, the first question is, why does painting, amongst all of these figurative practices, act as the predominant medium in this early 1980s period? As the demand for black representation gains ground throughout the decade, it acquires a transmedium character as an index of the reworking of the relationship between politics and aesthetics. So across painting, sculpture, photography, film, and installation, the whole question and debate about black representation acquires a transmedium character that acts as an index of the reworking of the relationship between politics and aesthetics, departing from modernist and avant-gardist models. In my view, from 1987 onwards, film and photography take a leading role in transforming the discursive field through which cultural identity got to be hammered out in the visual arts. We can think of the DMAX Collective, the founding of Autograph, Association of Black Photographers, alongside the 1986 Third Cinema Conference at Edinburgh, and the 1988 Black Film British Cinema Conference, where Stuart Hall delivered his New Ethnicities paper, all redefining in this later period in the decade a shift from anti-racism to black representation, which also resulted in a cross-generational conversation at a national level that then became increasingly global with the African-American reception of photography and film practice at the end of the decade. So I think the predominance of painting in the critical moment of 1982 finds explanation neither as a pedagogical issue, well, that's how you begin, nor as a common sense issue about mediums that are accessible or affordable. Because if a contrast is made in terms of image text practices within this period across the generations who were teaching in UK art schools, into which black British art students were entering, then what we find is not an opposition so much as a diagonal cut that I think complicates the narrative. So race is present in the visual field of a phototext piece such as Victor Bergin's UK 77. This is one of 11 panels. And this is a work that indicates a set of anti-racist commitments on the part of an artist of the new left generation, the class of 68, we might say. So it reckons with the key fault lines in British society. After all, the 1977 Grunwick strike was led by Jayabin Desai. Yet a major contrast is struck when the very clean handling of phototext in Bergin's case, which withdraws all markers of expressive subjectivity, is compared to the far messier kind of image-text hybridity produced in a painting such as Keith Piper's Reactionary Suicide, Black Boys Keep Swinging, Another Nigger Died Today of 1982. Now, this contrast is not a political discrepancy, since international socialism mattered immensely across the generations, across these two generations, those who were teaching, those who were being taught. Socialism mattered immensely to the outlook of Blk Art Group members, such as Piper and Chambers. Isaac Julian also was a member of Big Flame, which was an offshoot of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And indeed, the present speaker in 1977 was a member of the Young Communist League. It didn't last long, dear reader. And what I disliked most of all about my socialist identification was having to go to the pub after the meetings. And it's really that cultural disconnect that I think is much more important than the political alignments that were being reached for, but which didn't arrive in that moment, which only arrived later in the decade. So in the abstract, there's a degree of alignment politically between white tutors and black students, which is to say the generational disconnect. And at Nottingham Trent Polytechnic, there were members of Art and Language, the conceptual artists who taught in complementary studies. This generational disconnect fell not on political but on cultural lines. One might further describe a break between different feminist generations that was marked by race, but which turned upon a disconnect that was cultural rather than political or ideological. By the latter half of the 1980s, common ground had been found in a cultural studies vocabulary that placed the UK in a leading position with regards to understanding the formative role of representation in social constructions of identity and difference. But pulling back to the 1977 to 82 moment, in terms of the international art world, we can see the depth of disconnect that I've just described as something that was nonetheless pivotal and generative. It wasn't a negative thing, it actually made things happen. It had agency to it. In turning the Black Art Group debates towards the 1960s Black Arts movement as a source of inspiration that was diasporic in character. It may seem, on the face of it, academic or arcane to focus on medium and the question of painting. But in this early 80s period, painting was never neutral, for its resurgence was described in terms of a return to figuration that was an international trend in which neoconservative voices laid claim to in order to announce the ending of mixed media experimentation that had prevailed in art since the 1960s. So on the other side of the Atlantic in 1982, you have Hilton Kramer, who founded the New Criterion that was named after T.S. Eliot's Criterion Journal of the 1920s. And even though Kramer's patrician outlook was in conflict with market forces, which welcomed the return to painting because they saw figurative art in terms of big paintings that would attract big money and big hair. This is the 80s, after all. It's 30 years ago. When the return to figuration was encoded as, more broadly, a return to order, an ending of the political program of the 1960s, it was aligned with an anti-modernism that was later synchronized with a so-called return to family values in the New Right agenda, i.e. restoring order after the breakdown identified with the permissive freedoms of the 1960s. So in the early 80s, you have this set of voices from the right that are laying claim to painting and taking ownership of it in those reactionary terms. But counterposed to this was the politics of representation that was advocated specifically in lens-based practices, film and photography, especially phototext and independent film. And this was being led by post-68 voices from feminism, the New Left and other social movements that were now inscribed in higher education, translating ideas from French post-structuralism into a cultural politics of appropriation and resignification. So in 1977, you have the Pictures exhibition, also on the other side of the Atlantic, organised by Douglas Crimp, that introduced the concept of appropriation as a key idea that would undermine modernist values of originality, authenticity, medium specificity. And yet in the political hostility that Crimp expressed in a 1980 article called The End of Painting, we can begin to understand the antagonism, this left-right antagonism in art and politics that puts a figurative work such as this untitled piece by Claudette Johnson into something of an interpretive dilemma. Members of the Black Art Group are strenuously non-aligned with this left-right frontier effects. And this precipitates a return to the 1960s, to the African American Black Arts movement, as a kind of third space to be found beyond an either-or boundary that's marked out by a reactionary discourse of anti-modernism that claimed ownership of painting in order to eliminate politics from art, and an ostensibly progressive postmodernism that removed itself from the humanist values of expressive subjectivity in order to argue that representation was not just a matter of mimetic mark-making, a reflection or correspondence with reality, but part of all cultural practices that position subjects in relations of identity and difference, even though questions of race and ethnicity were not articulated into that progressive postmodernism until the latter part of the 1980s. So in 1982, you have a situation then in which young black artists are really between the devil and the deep blue sea. It's not just the depth of disconnect with their tutors that obliges them to act as self-starters who create agency by coming together to act collectively. and this is a pattern we see repeated throughout this period amongst artists, photographers and filmmaking. But that also the structured void that's built into archaic institutions that have no vocabulary for addressing the aspirations of an emergent Black British identity meant that there was no real response in terms of a genuine critical engagement, a genuine dialogue with their work and concerns with Black figurative practices that was being put forward in painting and photography. It wasn't taken up by the left because it was in the wrong medium. And it wasn't wanted by the neoconservatives because it was political. In a 1987 interview, Sonia Boyce said of her undergraduate years at West Stourbridge, quote, "What often happened at college was that if you were dealing with social issues, you were persuaded to work with photography and text, regardless of whether the style or the content of one's work was sympathetic to that format." Adding, quote, "Many people went down to the photography department and were never seen again." And Shubhata Biswas has also talked about being dissuaded from painting during this period. So refusing to take sides between the anti-modern and the postmodern, Black British figurative practices in the early 1980s are also wrestling with the constraints whereby art making tends to be viewed more broadly either as social protest that takes the form of documentary realism, because it's being addressed to political realities out there in social life, and on the other, the view that art is primarily an act of self-expression, which is the bedrock of institutional liberal humanism. And I think if early paintings and drawings by Sonia Boyce, by Keith Piper and others are cutting into a hybrid space so as to give recognition to an emerging Black British subject, it seems to me that there is an investment in testing the expressive potentials of traditional mediums, such as drawing, painting, in order to precisely register a subjective world of self and the external reality of the social, as they are inscribed at one and the same time in lived experience, alongside, and not mutually exclusive to, an exploration of intermedia, mixed media translations, which meant draftsmanship and photography in a work such as this by Sonia Boyce from 1985, or image, text and found object, as we've just seen in the assemblage character of Keith Piper's Reactionary Suicide. So rather than an either-or between art as protest or art as expression, the false choice imposed by the interpretive limitations of biographical reduction, you can only talk about your identity, you can only express yourself, and the equally problematic contextual reduction, you can only address your oppression, were being combated, were being redressed, I think, by the cut and mix aesthetic that was being explored in Blk Art Group members' practices. And for our part, 30 years later, I think that reading this work, revisiting this moment, perhaps makes it more relevant to think of George Kubler's approach, which is to see all art as problem-solving activity that goes beyond a mere reflection of the circumstances it was created and also transcends the subjectivity of the person who created it. In that interview with John Roberts in the first issue of Third Text, Boyce went on to say, quote, "My knowledge of a continuous history of work and initiatives by Black artists in this country is very sketchy. This not knowing acts as a stumbling block to analysis of the work and achievements made to date," end quote. Discussing the impact of discovering artists such as Uzo Egonu, Ronald Moody, Aubrey Williams and other first-generation practitioners, what was being described in the dilemma of not knowing one's artistic precursors during the formative years in which choices and decisions are being made is certainly an obstacle, a stumbling block to a story of artistic ancestry or influence that tends to be told in linear terms as a narrative of descent. But what if the obstacle was the very stimulus, the spur that acts as a springboard for a process of artistic self-invention? What if the enigma and the opacity of not knowing one's immediate artistic precursors is built into the very fabric of diaspora life, which arises out of the rupture and discontinuity of being cut off from one's origins, and thereby living at one remove from traditions that see the transmission of heritage in terms of a unilinear and unidirectional continuum. In other words, what if not knowing was the name of the question at the core of the problem-solving activity that Blk Art Group members were responding to in this moment through acts of answerability and double-voiced responsiveness? In Brown Coloured Black of 1983, the riddle that Donald Rodney addresses is not so much who am I, as much as how did I become who I am? Selfhood or identity is the subject matter being explored, but the expressivity being stenciled into the smudged words and by the indexical handprints is not leading to a self-congratulatory affirmation of adult identity, but to an open-ended inquiry that is self-investigative, precisely in the sense that Gramsci defines consciousness as an inventory of traces deposited in one's social and cultural formation. And I think this work suggests that if identity resists fixity, after all, each name, brown, coloured, black, sets into motion a kind of substitutability that implies unending differentiation or difference, then identity too is a site of not knowing. It's not something that can be fixed by a name, but something that's being called into question by the fact that there are at least three rather than one names. Rather than a lack to be filled in or a gap to be made whole, not knowing acts as a productive irritant, the grain of sand inside the shell, to which ever so many problem-solving responses are put forward in generative acts that produce something new to answer this foundational riddle or dilemma. Not knowing one's art historical ancestors is a stumbling block insofar as it complicates the lineage or parentage an artist lays claim to. One might say that in selecting and combining their chosen influences, all art students are inventing an identity by being imaginatively reparented and therefore choosing their own artistic lineage, their own artistic ancestors. But when this is often framed in Oedipal terms as a revolt against one's natural parents, one's given parents, in which it's assumed that something new can only be brought into being through acts of negation, by annihilating what came before, it's interesting to observe that for black diaspora artists in the process of becoming, this dilemma of not knowing leads to a very different emotional tone when it comes to addressing parental figures. In Voyage of My Father by Rodney of 1985 and then Pilgrim Fathers of 1986, the artist is, like Hamlet, engaged in a dialogue with someone who's not there, the absent one. And there's a mood of mourning or haunting, and loss that haunts the scene rather than Oedipal revolt. There's also the quest narrative that Isaac Julian embarked upon in Looking for Langston, 1989, that was also about a father figure that's gone absent or missing, and suggests that the not knowing that generates the desire to research the archive is not necessarily a scene of melancholia, but gives rise to what John Acumphra has called black necrophilia, a love of the dead, or an act of feeding off the dead, and what is lost and buried in the crypt. That comes about because not knowing is the very cause of the desire to investigate black Atlantic history, which is an abiding theme in black diaspora art practices. So the not knowing that brings black artists into dialogue with loss, absence, and structured voids aplenty. The African-American artist Renee Green, in her essay Archival Lacunae, refers to this as negation in abundance. This is what one encounters in the archives of slavery, the archive of colonialism. This not knowing, then, is intimately linked to the violence that Marlene Smith summons into the visual field in Untitled 1 and 2 of 1983. And here, the image-text relationship that activates a call and response dynamic between the fragmented lettering that says the most sacred commandment and the expressive stenciling, which says the word violated, whose painterly red drips evoke a scene of bodily violation, is double-voiced. in the sense that it's a simultaneous address to gender, with the broken halves of the Ghanaian fertility doll figuring the colonial encounter as rape, a sexual violation, and an address to race in the pictorial fragment. I don't have a pointer, but I have to see it. The pictorial fragment of a Benin ironwork ceremonial door, which is an artifact, most likely 16th century, like the Benin bronzes or ivory pendant masks of Ile-Ife that were plundered and stolen in the late 19th century in wars of colonial conquest. So the problem-solving activity that Blk Art Group work is producing then is pushing against the closed doors of the discourse of primitivism on the one hand, and let's bear in mind that in the 5 years between William Rubin's Primitivism, Affinities of the Tribal and Modern, 1984, and Jean-Hubert Martin's Magicien de la Terre of 1989, we have this massive paradigm shift, this massive transformation that takes place in the very vocabulary for dealing with identity and difference. This activity is not only pushing against the door of primitivism as much as it's pushing against the closed door of documentary realism, in which blackness is fixed as a social problem in anti-racist film and photography practices. But to go back to the parenting metaphor and to put it in slightly stronger register, one might say that those who found themselves abandoned to the archaic dullness of institutional inertia in late 1970s Britain were very much orphans of the storm. James Baldwin, when he described the diaspora condition as one in which blacks are the peculiar stepchildren of the West, was thinking along similar lines. At one level, orphans are incredibly self-reliant. They have to be self-starters. And I think over and above this familial metaphor, which I hope to justify in a moment, the collective agency whereby something new is brought into being through acts of cooperation that are trans-individual, to the extent to which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is really the principle that informs the way Black British initiatives multiply in the early 1980s. So these would include Elbow Room, Obala, Black Women's Creativity Project, Black Arts Alliance, DMAX, Autograph I've mentioned, and the film workshops, Black Audio Film Collective, Retake, Chedo, Sankofa. And I think in all this activity, what's being displaced is the romantic individualism of institutional modernism, and also the elitism of avant-garde models that assume leaders and followers. This collective activity is participatory. It's about constituting a counter-public sphere. And I think it's important to emphasize also the regional dimension, which is very important in the early 1980s. So you have Blue Art Centre in Liverpool, Rochdale Art Gallery, Wolverhampton Art Gallery, Midlands Art Centre, Chapter Arts in Cardiff, amongst many others. And it encourages us to think about how networks are formed, very much along the lines in which Lubena Himid has mapped out using the London Underground as a paradigm. But then thinking about how these networks surpass and transcend national boundaries, how they become diasporic and outer-national in their scope, in their reach. Because if we think about networks seriously, then unlike arboreal structures such as oak or pine, which map genealogies of a family tree in binary lines of descent, rhizomes such as strawberry, cassava, follow erratic and unpredictable paths by networking with elements in their environments and establishing connections in their environment that have no necessary belonging amongst one another. And in this way, rhizomorphic networks produce hybridity, because whereas arboreals suit the closed narratives of tradition, the nation state, which want to know who begat whom, what's your lineage, where do you come from, to which the diaspora can only respond with not knowing. That's the difference that discontinuity introduces. Orphanistas, who experience not knowing as a condition of entry into the art world, are not so much foundlings as bastards who must self-invent. So it's not for nothing that Eddie Chambers titled one of his projects The Black Bastard as Cultural Icon, which has the FU factor turned up to volume 11. So a central point, so how did they do this? How did they self-invent? In what way was this network one that was able to spill over national boundaries? And perhaps there's something ironic here in that the UK infrastructure is London-centric, although what's being collated here is not simply a phenomenon that went national because of the regional component, because it happened outside of London. And I do think the Midlands basis of the Blk Art Group coming together was terribly important. But to factor in the porous nature of those boundaries, whereby within a period of 5 years, by the late 80s, it had gone international as well. So how did they do this? How did they self-invent? A central point of reference for the debates that generated Blk Art Group activity was a 1971 anthology of writings edited by Addison Gale Jr. entitled The Black Aesthetic. And it's also very, very important to bear in mind the spelling of the group's name, because by subtracting the letters A and C from the word black, this was itself an act of homage, acknowledging formalist experimentation with the signifier of blackness that was a driving force in the 1960s US black arts movement, which also sought to produce an aesthetic that would reach out to popular audiences in order to engage political questions in a public sphere beyond the walls of the white cube in which modernism and the avant-garde had become institutionalized. But it's precisely at this point that we get to the crux of the matter, because you go through the editorial section of this anthology, The Black Aesthetic, on poetry, on literature, theatre and music, and the visual arts are nowhere to be found. They're not part of it at all. And in similar terms, on the other side of the translational equation, if you were to visit ICA, Tate Gallery or any UK venue in the 1977 to 1982 period, your chances of seeing work by African American artists of the late 1960s associated with the Black Arts Movement era, such as Betty Saar, David Hammond, or Noah Purifoy, would have been non-existent. So it's to say that instead of the classical model of translation as a one-to-one transmission between one language and another, where the criterion is fidelity, faithfulness in the correspondence, what we're dealing with in a work such as Black Assassin Saints by Keith Piper of 1982, which in many respects provides the closest fit of theory and practice in this regard, what we're dealing with, rather, is not a classical logic of translation, but a hybrid logic of migrant translation, in which the journey through which signifiers travel when they're moving from one space to another is one that radically transforms their semiotic value. Even as such, mistranslation or distranslation, from the point of view of the classical model, is what enables a new node, a new point of connection to be established within a rhizomatic network that expands transnationally across closed borders. So on a 6-foot by 12-foot fabric rectangle, silk-screened prints of a Nigerian Ife mask form the heads to 4 bodies that are made up of handwritten inscriptions on red, yellow, green and black grounds. As each allegorical figure is identified as a writer, painter, actor and musician, Piper's 1983 dissertation for his degree explained, quote, "The concept from which this piece stems is the essay Black Magic, Black Art by Ron Milner, in which he explores the dilemma of being an artist operating in the actual teeth of political struggle." And a quote within a quote from Milner. "My friend was one of those who believed we black artists should beat our saxophones and typewriters into spears and daggers and be recorded in history as the Black Assassin Saints," end quotes. So to say this black British artwork translates an African American source is to say the routes through which signifying elements migrate across time from a 1967 article that was published by an African American playwright in Negro World Digest to a 1982 West Midlands art school is also an intermediate journey from the realm of theatre, which is actually where the Black Arts Movement began in 1964 with writings by Leroy Jones, Larry Neal and others, to the medium of painting. But then we should also notice how the very form and medium in this migrant act of translation resembles nothing so much as the banners held aloft in British trades union marches and other public demonstrations as vernacular works of visual culture that are anchored in British working class traditions. And the paradox of translation does not stop there, it only begins. The title of Reactionary Suicide that we saw just a moment ago is obviously in dialogue with the 1971 autobiography of the Black Panther leader, Huey Newton. Let me just go back to it, for those of you seeing it for the first time. So it's referring to Huey Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, of 1971. But then the T-shirt of the figure who appears to be lynched onto the picture plane, Dennis the Menace, is torn from the pages of the Beano, no less, wearing a red and black stripy jumper whose anarchist colours were pivotal to punk iconography. There's also a passing reference to a Bowie track in the subtitle, but to the extent that the originality of the piece is entirely Piper's own, this translation is not a copy or a version of a pre-existing African-American artwork, even though it's extraordinary to consider how far it calls to mind Injustice Case by David Hammons. In each case, found objects create assemblage works on the basis of a cut and mix collage aesthetic that establishes relations to the real that make diagonal cuts across the mimetic codes of representational realism. And the indexical mark making, the body print in Hammonds's case, we saw the hands in Reactionary Suicide, is also the means by which black male bodies are inscribed in terms that undercut figurative codes in which blackness is always already captured by the dominant voicing of race and representation, which was the closed door of exoticism in primitivism, social problem in documentary realism. And I think it's also interesting to note that for their part, on the other side of the Atlantic, painters such as Kerry James Marshall entered into problem-solving activity in this domain by denaturalizing the colour black within the figurative idiom. And in Glenn Ligon's case, by gradually moving from the figurative to the figural, so as to replace the images of bodies with bodies of text that had been smudged into abstraction by repetitive stenciling. So in Most Wanted Persons by Keith Piper of 1984, the translation moves between a graphic design template that we find in the Penguin Books edition of George Jackson's autobiography, Blood in My Eye, and his prison letters, Soledad Brother, with portraits from Leni Riefenstahl's photographic picture book, People of Cow, 1976. So the cross-mixing involved in this hybrid act, this very messy hybrid act of translation, involves an act of appropriation that takes materials from two diametrically opposed sources to produce something entirely new, hybrid, and distinctively Black British, by way of a cut and mix process of selection and combination that does not reproduce the terms of Riefenstahl's primitivism any more than it copies a pre-existing African-American artwork. If anything, I think Most Wanted Persons, and these are only 2 out of 4, is best read as post-pop, in that it returns to an engagement with recognizable popular culture materials, but does so neither to affirm nor to protest the politics of race, but really to draw attention to the process of mediation and packaging, whereby it's precisely the commodity form, the book in this case, or more specifically the photograph, it's precisely the commodity form that allows signifying material to move, migrate, and translate from one diasporic location to another. And vinyl records or 35mm film would also do the trick. So without the expressive heat of those painterly resources, the smudges, the broken lettering, the repetitive stenciling, and so on, the rather cold-hearted conceptualism that Piper also produced in the early 1980s is politically pointed, but does it court a kind of cynicism of already knowing the answer to the problem-solving that it addresses? Likewise, I think it might be instructive to observe the point where the figurative breaks down and collapses. In Middle Passage by Donald Rodney and Good Housekeeping by Marlene Smith, which in my view are important precisely because they reveal something in their unresolved condition. Both works show that realism is inadequate and overwhelmed when faced with the question of violence as it is experienced in black diaspora life, which is the subject matter that each work is addressing. What Blk Art Group practices such as these were straining against was precisely the way that blackness is trapped in the representational codes of documentary realism, where it's a social problem, or the discourse of modernist primitivism, where the black body will always already be spoken for as someone else's other. So by way of conclusion, I want to bring into play the fear and fantasy formulation that appeared in a 1983 work by Piper, To You, I Was Just a Body, Your Worst Fear and Your Best Fantasy, Everything to You But Human. Because this fear and fantasy formulation was indispensable to the breakthrough moment of the latter part of the 1980s, when the concept of fetishism cut a path into the analysis of representation, of race and representation. But to do that, I need to make two further observations about the figurative and about the orphan's plight, so as to indicate what lay on the other side, as it were, of the perforations and passageways that some of the choices amongst Blk Art Group practices were opening onto. So the body is centrally present in Donald Rodney's The House That Jack Built of 1987 in the form of a signifying indirection that negotiates the risks whereby blackness is already captured and spoken for in the domain of the figurative. The seated figure, who resembles the bound figure in David Hammond's Injustice case, this kind of scarecrow-like figure, wears clothes that signify human presence, even though the body has been hybridized into a tree trunk whose bare branches evoke strange fruit indeed. The subtitle, which you can see at far left, Self-Portrait, amongst the X-ray panels that form the shape of a house, evokes a body that's surviving the onslaught of pain from within, as the X-rays are literally appropriated or taken back from the artist's medical treatment for sickle cell anemia, but also violence that comes from without, in the sense that the house seems to be asking us whether the violence historically brought to bear on black bodies can ever be contained or housed as such. It's the nature of violence to violate boundaries, to overflow or exceed coherent boundaries. It's significant also that racial signification is carried by text. Blackness is being signified in the text, not in the figurative representation of the body, rather than the sculptural figure, because the expressive impact of the piece stems not from any mimetic sense of representational figuration, but from the indexical nature of the X-rays that represent the artist's body through signifiers that have been created through direct physical contact between the body and the material. Is there a sense then in which the scissors, which you can also see in the house, that repeat as a motif, bear witness to surgeries endured, but also to a problem-solving activity, looking to cut openings and passageways into the closed codes of race and representation so as to bring black bodies into a new space of resignification. The X-rays that form a grid in which figure-ground relationships are constructed in Blood in My Eye of 1986 results in silhouettes that also slip outside a representational space in which race would be signified through mimesis. For here too, it is text that addresses diaspora history and the violence it's endured allegorically as a body afflicted. And just a quote from the passage on my right, "History bleeds its vile contents. Hell hath no fury like a nigger scorned. Let the surgery begin," end quote. To the extent that the two silhouettes are engaged with an omnipresent sense of violence that brings their animated bodies into proximity with death, the stained glass window effect of the grid introduces a dimension that could be read as religious by virtue of its association with church, or equally as something metaphysical in the scale of its gravitas. And in view of Keith Piper's reflections in the text that was written as part of A Ship Called Jesus of 1981, that one common autobiographical factor amongst the male members of the Blk Art Group was the black church, there's the question of how explorations of diaspora history are shot through with a prophetic voice that's empowered to wield chronotopes that address the ancient past and an apocalyptic future, in terms, however, that often reproduced a gendered language of righteous self-certainty. Or, as Piper asked in that essay, why was the title of the very first exhibition organised by the Blk Art Group, Blk Art and Done, as if the first should also be the last? At one level, gender is a fault line that cuts through and perforates the entire Blk Art Group story. And the early 1980s moment in which black women artists organised independently to create spaces of autonomy through a kind of strategic separatism can be seen as another kind of critical return to the cultural politics of the 1960s. And in this respect, the parallels between the black arts movement and the women's art movement of the late 60s, early 70s have been noted by Lisa Gale Collins, the African-American art historian, although what was tactical about the way black women acted on the autonomy principle in the early 1980s was that it undermined the idea of a fixed hierarchy of oppressions by putting forward instead an emphasis on the intersectionality upon which all identities are based. But to the extent that this really takes place, this unfolds in the second half of the decade. The problem-solving activity that begins to unlock the black body from its representational enclosure in figurative codes is one inflected by black feminist, lesbian and gay voices that converge around the concept of fetishism in the analysis of visual racism. In 1983, the fear and fantasy formulation is present in Piper's The Body Politic and also in The Other Question, The Stereotype and Colonial Discourse by Homi Bhabha that was published in the film studies journal Screen. But it's when film and photography begin to take the lead in the debates on black representation with the Cultural Identity season that John Acumpha co-organised with members of the London Filmmakers Co-op held at the Commonwealth Institute in 1986, that connections are made really for the first time across mediums and across disciplines that in many respects were not fully present to one another in that earlier period. Hence, with the shift into phototext in a work such as Go West Young Man of 1987, and then into computer-generated photomontage in lightbox installations, as in Transgressive Acts of 1993. This is part of a strand of practice in which Piper took up questions of gender and masculinity. But I want to add, is there not also an ongoing dialogue with the problem-solving activity that Donald Rodney initiated with his use of X-rays? And also to observe if there might be something else at play in the stained glass panelling that surrounds a post-medium practice such as this. The sexual violence of slavery and colonialism meant that fatherhood was always a movable feast, or as Hortense Spillers put it in her 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, we may say that an orphan's plight may include ancestors who are also unwelcome and unwanted. So I'm making a link to the Dirty Words Pictures of 1977 by Gilbert and George, not to assert unbidden influence in relation to the stained glass window, the use of the grid, but to suggest a subterranean dialogue in the 1977 to 1982 period that complicates any attempt to write diaspora art histories as straightforward chronologies. Rhizomorphic networks twist and turn through space and time to engender multiple surprises. The photographed graffiti that we can see in a work such as this gives Gilbert and George's handling of image and text an expressive dimension that was hygienically erased by Victor Bergin in this very same moment. And this is one that is complicated by the politics of race in view of the way in which their libertarian refusal to take sides in 1977 meant that they were seen as moving along with right-wing drift. But I think it's an important part of the dialogue that needs to be taken into account. So yeah, The rhizomorphic network as a model for the writing of diaspora-based art histories, then, means fully reckoning with the consequences of the unpredictable and erratic relations that hybrids form among elements in their outlying environment. To say that there are identifications that may at one level be unwanted or unwelcome is to accept the complexity of a bastard heritage that cannot be purified into a neat, clean narrative of linear descent. Hence, rather than a straightforward passage from the 60s to the 1970s generation of black British artists to the early 1980s, which was very much Stuart Hall's trajectory, the twists and turns whereby the Blk Art Group cohort introduced a diasporic identification with the US black arts movement is, I think, what differentiates them from what could be called the generation of the last colonials, which is Hall's phrase, and also the cosmopolitan and migrant cluster within that generation. I'm thinking of Rashid Areen, David Medella, Gavin Jantes, for instance, who could also be described as amongst the last moderns too. Whereas post-pop figuration, as we saw in Most Wanted, meant investigated the routes and channels in popular culture through which 1960s African-American blackness travelled and translated through cultural networks that are infused by Caribbean and African components throughout the 70s. The critical reading of American pop that Rashid Areen delivered in 1978 at the state-of-the-art conference at Tate Gallery that was also reproduced in Black Phoenix was one in which he interpreted pop as an unequivocal expression of American cultural imperialism, not available for appropriation. And this, I think, would have foreclosed the connective links that artists of the 1980s generation were making. Conversely, one can fully understand then that in the face of the transatlantic turn undertaken by the 1980s generation, this may also have meant that the problem of not knowing was further exacerbated from the point of view of the preceding generations who may have felt that their viewpoints went unrecognised. But my last point is to say that on the African-American side of the story, a further point of contact, another kind of subterranean connection to be made through a network model, is between the cut and mix aesthetic that the Blk Art Group were exploring in two-dimensional mediums and the sculptural assemblages using found objects. I'm thinking of a work such as Noah Purifoy's So What's of 1966 that was constructed from rubble left behind by the Watts riots of South Central Los Angeles. And the connection here is that these introduce a signification of reality, not in terms of representational mimesis, but through the power of indexical signs that already part of reality. And I think it's only now, some 40 years after the late 1960s Black Arts movement, with Kelly Jones's research into the local specificity of African American practices in Los Angeles, that attention has turned to the actual art that was produced under the auspices of a discourse that was primarily addressed to theatre, to literature, to poetry and music. So if 5 black British art students brought something new into being through an act of imaginary identification that took place in the Black Atlantic diaspora, it may be that what was being responded to first and foremost was the manifesto-like language of a book such as The Black Aesthetic. This is a future-orientated drive in which the voices that defined the 1960s Black Arts movement were speaking about their desire. They were talking about what they wanted black art to be, rather than talking about what it actually was. Writing up such a black diaspora history, then, demands that we take account of the real-world consequences of imaginative acts of identification as responses to the not knowing that activates problem-solving activity in the first place. Okay. End.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, what can I say? I mean, talk about raising the bar and starting the conference on incredibly sound footing. And as Kobena mentioned, often in these, when the Black Art movement is spoken about or discussed in various art circles, it's never focused on the work and how it fits into national and global narratives of art history. I think what Kobena has done is quite clearly demonstrated that rather than seeing AYBs as a problem or as the problem, in fact what that period did and what the artists did at that time was a bold, new and creative approach to questions of diaspora, to this idea of not knowing, and to creating something new, a new way of approaching and navigating the pathway between politics and aesthetics. So what we'll do now is, we are running quite late, but definitely I'm sure you want to have some feedback to the presentation. So I'd like to encourage 2 or 3 questions before we move on to the next session. So please raise your hand and then we'll get a mic out to you. We've got someone who's going to... Amna? Would you like to... Is it not working? Okay. I think if you press the red button... Yeah.
Fantastic talk and really, really helpful in situating different kinds of impulses that I've struggled with and not managed to put together such elements. So thank you very much. Just that last point that you drew out with the dirty words, pictures. I think I remember reading I don't know if it was a letter from Rashid in Art Monthly around the late 70s, which must have been about that set of works in an exhibition. And one of the issues, apart from being interpolated, I think there's one particular piece that has some reference to it. So apart from that sense of being interpolated within the white cube space in that way, one of the issues that I think comes up is this problem of how that particular group of artists are being then seen by artists that Rashid respects, like Victor Berg and John Staybaker, not speaking out. And I wonder whether, because again, coming to this historical point rather than lived experience, is it that kind of silence on the part of the left where they have got an allegiance with black students but are not sort of condemning figures like Gilbert and George, that creates the kind of absolute divisions of black and British in the 80s. I wonder if there's a way to respond to that.
Yeah, I think the advantage of hindsight, of being able to look at this moment historically, would be to think about connections or articulations that weren't possible in the heat of the moment when decisions have to be made. I think to frame the issue through the lens of that letter by Rashid Areen is to take us back to that moment rather than reflect on what I was trying to suggest in terms of how networks make connections with tendencies or practices that may not be scripted, may not be anticipated. But I think the stained glass connotation is important to what Gilbert and George are doing in terms of politics of transgression, the secular and the sacred, and so on, within the context of their right-wing libertarianism. So I think it's one-dimensional simply to take an anti-racist reading. They were extremely controversial. I think one would need to unpack the whole conjuncture. But I'm hesitant about returning to it exclusively, that's all I'm saying, exclusively through the lens of an anti-racist critique.
Okay, in the interest of time, can I ask for 2 more questions, and just questions, not commentaries. I think David had his hand up, and Shishka. So 2 questions, please. I'll pass the mic back. There will be more time for discussion, but we're kind of pressed.
Okay, I will be quick as I can, but I'm afraid I do have to preface my question with one
quick preface,
which is to say thank you for that presentation, which I thought was incredibly generous and timely, in that it returns us to a moment that enables us to think about a legacy you use the figure of the orphan, and I think in terms of thinking about the bastard orphan, you can say that the bastard orphan may have such a complex inheritance, or perhaps no inheritance at all, but that does not mean that the orphan has nothing to bequeath. I want to ask you about legacy, in terms of the bequest of the orphan.
Okay.
And I want to ask you about the ways in which the generous account you've given of the wealth of that moment gives us an incredibly wealthy, rich, and by the same token, complex legacy to begin to unpack. So within that, you've given us some direction. And again, I think that's been generous of you in a kind of judicious and a kind of accountable way to account for this legacy. How do we begin? Where do we begin? Cut and mix, you say, is the place to begin. And in that, you give us a direction to forget about the arguments, forget about contextualization. Look at the practice. That's where the wealth is. It's in the practices. There's a lot of it. And I think I'm just going to ask you to just give us some pointers, some indications in terms of the practices.
Oh, okay. It's something easy.
Where to start? You mentioned a number of them in terms of the breakdown of the figure.
Okay.
Okay.
Before Kobena have to do that in about 30 seconds, I'll ask Shukta to please question in a very short, but I'm sure very articulate mode, please. At this stage, because we need to get on with the presentation.
Shall I take the mic?
Yes, please.
Shall I take another question?
Another question, and then
Both.
both.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and Kobena, I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it raised some very, very key, hugely key issues in terms of contextualizing practice, aesthetics, etc. Paul, I'm going to try and ask a question, but as with David, it is very difficult. So
Very short
I'll try to keep short, and I wanted to pick up on two.
we can come back to questions in the last session, okay? But
I wanted
just
to
really
pick
quickly,
up on
please.
2 points. And the first, strangely enough, connects to Amna's point about the sort of new left, if you like, or the left, such as Victor Bergin and John Tagg, etc. And also the second question relates to the question of the orphan, the bastard, if you like. And in view of the first, I'd maybe like to mention something, because I was a student at the University of Leeds, the first to ever go and study fine art and art history there between 1981 and 85. And in approximately, I think it was 83 or 84, I undertook a performance piece which was solely the sort of sole participant of which, if you like, well, actually that's not entirely true, but John Tagg was the centre person within the context of that piece. Now this is a piece that was later repeated with Griselda Pollock a few months later, but I think it's interesting in terms, and it's actually recently been acquisitioned by Tate, so it is something that will hopefully be out there in the public domain much more soon. But in terms of this particular point, I wanted to say that when this particular performance work was executed, and it was called Kali, Black Goddess, and John Tagg was the centre sort of focus or focal point. It was very curious because one of the things, of course, as you know, he's very much out of that Victor Bergin sort of association.
Yeah.
He actually responded and said, you know what, I have not really considered the context of race and gender in terms of questions that were being raised by the New Left at that particular point in history. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second relates to the question of
Perhaps we could interrupt because there's the previous question and
maybe respond to those 2 points then, to the point about legacy and Shita's point. I think we'll have to then move on from there.
Orphan is an interesting one, or the bastard, if you like. Certainly, I was, you know, that Asian or black-blasted when I was a student. But I do think, I would ask, yes we are, but also are we?
Right.
Wow.
Kobena.
Okay. Well, what comes to mind immediately is Rashid Areen's 1977 self-portrait as Paki Bastard. And that is very much engaged with the lacunae, what was missing in the class of 68, in terms of a vocabulary which has these structured voids in it. And I think that in retrospect, instead of the language of culpability, is there someone to blame? Who is at fault? We could look at the discursive formation of those subjects to look at what was closed from one another. I mean, that's the post-colonial moment, 1978, when Edward Said, Stuart Hall, this term enters into circulation, although Aubrey Williams used it much earlier in the 1960s. So depersonalizing is one way of getting to the issues. So in that sense, to extract from these instances, whether it's Victor Bergin versus Gilbert and George, or whether it's John Tagg versus you, what is the concept to extract from that so that we can depersonalize? Because that's the only way to advance. And that's the big advantage of looking at it historically. And that's the story also, I think, psychically, in terms of what happened, what came around at the end of the 1980s. Because our tutors are not substitutes for parents. They're like transitional figures. You can identify with them, you can rebel against them. It's a very different relationship. And I don't think I wanted to suggest that Bastard or Orphan was an end point. I was offering it as a starting point for thinking about what it takes to self-start, what it takes to invent when you find yourself in a structured void, and think about a future. Instead of reacting, you know, why do I not have this knowledge? Instead of a paranoid scenario of somebody's taken it away from me, we're looking at this cut and mix aesthetic as an imaginative response to really extreme conditions, but not unusual conditions. And that relates to the other point too, because I think the legacy is dispersed. I don't think it's transmitted in a straight line. And I think cut and mix aesthetic is something that digital technology has made available to everyone. So at one level, the kind of high hopes that the postmoderns had, that this would revolutionize consciousness, has really taken a neoliberal turn. Is that part of the legacy? I mean, I think that would be one thing to think of. But within your question, I think a broader part of it is what I see the group looking for in turning to the black aesthetic discourse is a way of joining aesthetics and politics to challenge existing definitions of what black politics was. And I think that's also a significant difference from the preceding generation. And there too, though, there's a big question in terms of that legacy, because, you know, in the 30 intervening years, the relationship between black diaspora art practice and the politics of the market, the politics of institutions, has undergone a huge transformation, really as a result of the interventions that were brought about from that moment. So I think the concept that I'd introduce there is the idea of the public sphere and the extent to which a counter-public sphere was being created by these networks. But that there can't be a one-size-fits-all answer. There has to be a conjunctural moment-by-moment analysis to look at the twists and turns of what that legacy has resulted in. I think the way in which the set of ideas coming out of the Black British context were taken up in the African American world, for example, was entirely unanticipated. I don't think anybody was thinking about that in 1982. Again, it's not a straight line of saying that someone's been influenced by what was taking place in 1982, but they're a kind of a thread or a connection to be made in that regard.
Okay, I know that there are more questions for Kobena, but we do have to move on. I don't think I've been very mean so far. I was tasked with the idea of the thing of being mean, and I've actually been quite liberal so far. So I have to switch from liberal mode into dictatorial mode in order for us to get through this. But I'd like to thank Kobena for his incredibly rich presentation.